Guess it's on. Can you hear me? Yes? Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Steer, and I'm an associate professor of political science here at Washington State University. Today I have the very distinct pleasure of introducing a very distinguished guest to Washington State University on behalf of the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service. Bill Gates Sr. is a prominent lawyer, civil activist, philanthropist, husband, father, and grandfather, not necessarily in that order. He currently serves as co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill earned his bachelor in law degrees from the University of Washington. I was allowing for a few minutes for rebuttal. Following 3 years of U.S. Army service in World War II, he became a partner in the law firm of Scheidler, McBroom, and Gates and Lucas in 1964, guiding it through growth and mergers that would eventually establish Preston, Gates, and Ellis, today known as K&L Gates. Bill has served as a trustee, board member, officer, volunteer for more than 24 Northwest organizations, including the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce, King County United Way, and as a University of Washington on the University of Washington Board of Regents. As former chair of the Washington State Tax Structure Study Committee, appointed by Governor Gary Locke in 2001, Bill is also a leading advocate for tax reform in Washington. Bill and his late wife, Mary Maxwell Gates, raised 3 children, Christiane, Bill, and Libby. He's now married to Mimi Gardner Gates and resides in Seattle, Washington, where he continues his lifelong commitment to many civic programs, cultural organizations, and business initiatives. Today, Mr. Gates is going to talk to you about Initiative 1098, Taxing the Wealthiest in Washington. Mr. Gates.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction, and I'm just delighted to be here to talk about 1098. I guess I start off talking about these scores that you see on the screens. And what is that all about? Well, is this my prediction for the Apple Cup? Let me assure you that this presentation is not about football. In fact, this is the only time you'll hear me say something like this, which is, I'm glad we didn't beat you. And what these numbers refer to is the total tuition increase that both University of Washington and WSU have made in the past 2 years to cope with budget cuts. That is about 28% more from students to pay for their education while the economy was shrinking. Meanwhile, more budget cuts are expected just around the corner. So I'm delighted to be able to speak with such a large group of engaged students, faculty, and staff about a very important initiative that will be on the ballot in the next few weeks. It has everything to do with the future of our universities, the future of education, and the health of the state. This slide shows the fact that we started this initiative by a coalition of respected business, labor, and community leaders who support a careful, balanced reform of our state's tax system. It's designed to benefit the majority of its citizens, strengthen small business, and help fund education and health care. Over 200 organizations have already endorsed the initiative, and this slide shows a sample of those folks. Next. So, we have an unavoidable obligation. It is to improve public education and fund basic health care here in Washington, as well as a need to move in the direction of a more equitable tax structure. This slide shows a technical but nevertheless very significant element of this demand upon us. It's the language of our state constitution, which refers to a paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children. Under court rulings, the legislature is required to define basic education and then to make ample provision. As you may know, a King County judge recently ruled that Washington is violating this provision of the Constitution by underfunding education. That decision is on its way to a higher court. The problem underlying this decision is just hanging over our heads, and it isn't going to go away. We are obliged to do something. Next slide. This shows some reforms which are already in place by our state legislature, but without any funding to support them. They've laid out some specific things: longer school days, a requirement for 24 credits as against a current requirement of 20 credits, and an endorsement of bold reforms. Meanwhile, the economic crisis has meant decreasing revenues for education over the last 2 years rather than the needed increase. In 2010, we know the governor and legislature had a difficult time balancing the budget and needed a month-long special session to create a budget composed of cuts and new revenue, primarily from the so-called 7-Eleven taxes. Many people don't like these taxes. The legislature used them to help avoid a whole range of difficult cuts. The list on this slide shows a sample of some of the costs that were on the chopping block. All these will likely be back on the chopping block to balance the governor's new budget deficit in the next budget, given the state's dismal revenue forecast. Now, here specifically is a slide which shows the history of our financial support of public education in this state. As these charts show, there's a drop in investment in K-12 education from 24th in the country to 46th in terms of our contribution to public education as against the income and wealth of our state. The other chart shows our funding per pupil, having fallen behind 20 states. We've gone from 17th to 37th in just 15 years. So even without the paramount duty language in the Constitution, I think we would readily join together in the proposition that a good education is right at the top of the list of those things we are obliged to provide to our young folks and to our businesses. I have the temerity to suggest that these graphs establish undeniably that we're not performing on our own expectations. This chart shows the situation in higher education. As I pointed out in the introduction, both the University of Washington and WSU have faced millions of dollars in cuts in the past few years, and they've had to raise tuition 14% each of the past 2 years to keep afloat. In fact, all 6 public universities in the state have had to make these same increases. But the decline in state funding for higher education is not just a phenomenon of the current recession. Since 2001, state spending is up by 38%, as you see on the slide, but state support for the University of Washington is down by 12%, as this slide shows. State funding for the UW has been decreasing and tuition increasing over the past 2 decades. There's hope that funding will return over time, but until it does, all of our public universities must fear slipping into mediocrity from which they cannot recover in just a day or two, or even in a few years. And I cite the really unfortunate example of the University of Oregon as evidence of how this works. Public universities are the surest and necessary path to a prosperous future for Washington State and for the country as a whole. Our economic future depends on them. So, and here, just an add-on, is a picture of what's happening in healthcare. The thousands of seniors and disabled have lost adult day health care, which is to say, health, therapeutic, and social services for those at risk of being placed in a nursing home. State funding for child vaccinations has been cut back. In 2009, 40,000 state residents lost basic health coverage under the voter-approved basic health plan. In 2010, there was talk of cutting another 70,000 residents and eliminating the plan altogether. And this graph shows this decrease of those on the health care problem over the last 18 months. See the dramatic increase in more than 100,000 residents being on the waiting list. Now let's talk about an interesting feature of life in this state, which was the central element of the study that I chaired with the committee back at the turn of the century. If you think we were looking bad in our educational rankings of 46 in the country, how do you feel about ranking 50th out of 50? And that in terms of the basic fairness of our tax code. The Washington tax code ranks dead last. Now, there's really no argument, I don't think, about the fact that this is a bad way to run a state operation. And it's, of course, it's evident that it's bad if you're the 50th out of 50. But it seems to me simple that all income categories should be proportional to the other in terms of their contribution to the costs of the state. And many of us would argue, perhaps many of you in this room would argue, that it actually ought to slant the other way, that it should be progressive in nature, and that the portion of income being paid for public education in the state should be more of a burden on the well-to-do than upon the poor. So this picture is the exact opposite of that. We have a situation where those who make the least income in the state, and that's the vertical pile to the far left of the graph, pay somewhere in the neighborhood of 17% of their incomes in taxes each year, while the wealthiest people pay around 2.6. This means the poorest relatively pay 6 times as much of their family income to support the state as its wealthiest citizens. The middle class pays 4 times as much, and that would be the third blue pile over from the left, which is contributing 11%, again, versus 2.6% from the wealthiest 1%, which is that little pile out to the far right. Now let's take a look at the same slide in a slightly different context. Here are us and our 3 neighbors, California, Oregon, and Idaho. And this is a very interesting illustration of this phenomenon of who's paying to run the state. You look at all of the other 3 states, and while it's not a perfect line across the top, it's pretty doggone close to proportionality. This is exactly the same analysis as in the Washington slide that I showed last, and this is just a smaller version of that same data. So Oregon, pretty straight across, and the ingredients, of course, in the Oregon stack are sales tax, property tax, and income tax. And you see how across the various quintiles these colors change until you get out to the far right, and the blue bar, which is income tax, is way, way higher than either the property or sales taxes. California, very similar situation, and note how the sales tax, which is the brown bar, keeps going down, and the income tax keeps going up, and while it's not a nice, clean, straight line, it could be a lot worse, as we demonstrate, and the same with Idaho. So that's the kind of situation against which we are working in terms of relative treatment of the folks who live and work in our state. So, what will 1098 do? Let's see, I guess I want to say one more, I'm sorry, could we go back one? I guess I just want to mention that, looking at our slide again, that we're talking about, and I'll get to the details in a minute, but we're talking about an income tax which is imposed on high income, high earners. And notice that, that people are going to say, well, you can't just pick on the rich people. Well, let's be very clear about the fact. What we're talking about is a very modest movement from the pile on the left to the pile on the right. And if we put those on this graph, you would think we hadn't made much of a change, and that is a fair comment about it. But at least it's going in the right direction, and it seems to me, above anything else, there's no basis for complaining if you live out there in that right-hand bar. Doesn't make any sense for us to be concerned about some unfairness about this tax. So, what is the tax? Well, in terms of individuals filing individual federal income tax returns, it begins at $200,000. So up to $200,000, a person in this state would pay nothing under this new regimen. And in terms of a couple filing joint return, you would pay nothing until you reach $400,000 of income. And that 5% goes on until, in the case of individuals, you get to $500,000, which then incurs a rate of 9%. And with couples at $1 million, the 9% sets in. At the same time, there is a 20% cut in the state portion of the real property tax and the elimination of the B&O tax on more than 157,000 small businesses. These are parts of this scheme which address what we know what bothers people most. Their property taxes and people in business who pay the B&O tax, which as you know, there's hardly any argument. This state has never liked the B&O tax. We put it in because we had no ability back in the 1930s to do an income tax. So this B&O tax was put in, and as you know, one of the really unusual things about it is businesses have to pay that tax whether they made any money or not. And the provisions of 1098 would provide relief for basically all of the small businesses that are paying the B&O tax. So, the revenue which is raised by this income tax will go into the education legacy trust account, a thing which has existed for some time, happens to be the place where estate tax proceeds go. And it funds priorities like, excuse me, K-12 class size reductions, extended learning opportunities, pre-kindergarten, expanding access to higher education, which we're all very conscious of, and a portion will be dedicated to funding the voter-approved basic health plan. So it does a lot of good stuff. And the picture for that is that we would raise, according to figures that the state has come up with, somewhere in the neighborhood, when we get out to 2013, we would raise somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion, which would go about $400 million to reducing the property tax, another $260 million to reducing the B&O tax, leaving a net annual gain of about $2.3 billion, which would be divided 70% to education, 30% to health care. And that is the basic idea of I-1098. So I guess I'll go ahead to just mention some of the things that are being put forth in opposition to this. Let me go to slide 15. this is the assumption that is being made that if this goes in, then surely the next thing that's going to happen is that we're going to get a more general state income tax. I think that's very difficult to predict. I think that our legislature has shown an absolutely monstrous disinclination to create income taxes. It will have the ability under this initiative to make a change, because it's the law of this state that after 2 years, the legislature can amend a public initiative. So that power is there. So they could set aside the provision in 1098 which says no changes in the income tax without a vote of the people. And they could take that out 2 years from now. It would be a very gutsy thing for the state legislature. That's why I'm not a bit sure they would do that. If they were settled on the idea that they wanted a broader income tax, which reached down to $25,000 or $30,000 income levels, then they would need to face the fact that there will be a public vote, because even if they take that out of the initiative, there isn't the slightest doubt in my mind that a referendum would follow, just as Wednesday follows Tuesday. That we would, so there will be, if there's going to be a general income tax here, it's going to be because the public votes on and approves of it. And I think it's really very doubtful that the public would approve of it. So there you are. Okay, this next slide shows whether or not this whole thing is bad for business, which is what the opposition is claiming. And this just shows something about the relative impact of the income tax on citizens in the various states. And, you know, at the $1 million level, we still, out of the western states, would be paying at the lowest effective rate under the tax, which is imposed by I-1098. That's us on the far left in the charts, and it goes California, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, and Oregon. So, in closing, I just think that what it says on the board is exactly right. We can't fund 21st century education and public services with the tax structure from 1935. This is a long overdue measure that will create more and stable tax system for our citizens and businesses and invest in vital services that will ensure a strong and vibrant state. So, my injunction is vote yes on 1098. It's good for Washington. So, let's have a discussion if anybody has questions or anything to say. Sure.
Questions? Yeah.
You know, I don't think there are 2% of the people in the state that even understand that this is the situation. Which is very sad.
So I have here then.
Mr. Gates, the B&O tax on small business, I'm glad you pointed that out because it is a horrible tax.
Right. We have picked up a few friends with that ingredient.
Presentation of what 1098 will do and why it actually will be the results will be better than what we have now. But underlying all of that is why we need this sort of thing. And I don't know how often you make it out to the Palouse. We feel a little bit remote out here. We do have a big university out here in Washington State, and we're simply dying out here. We had a $52 million cut 2 years ago. On top of that, another $13 million, and now $11 million cut. And we're simply destroying the university, simply destroying it in the process, which means we're essentially destroying the future of our state and destroying the chances for our students to be competitive with students in other states and internationally as well. And I wonder if you've thought about that, or if you've heard from other groups. Do people across the state really understand just how absolutely abysmal it is here in terms of the budget?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I guess maybe my question would be, would you be willing to take on some speaking engagements out in this part of the world? But obviously, you speak with force.
I would go with you anywhere.
Beautiful. Well, this is a very successful thought. Seriously, I'm not a bit sure what the level of understanding is about our situation. I did say a moment ago that I didn't think that there was any broad understanding of the regressivity of our system. I feel comfortable saying that. As to whether people are impressed by these things that have happened to our four-year universities, I'm not sure. You know, there are, I guess I don't care what your proposition is. There are people out here and people out there in response to it. And so I'm sure there are folks around who say, well, that's those big universities, that's the right thing to do. We ought to be, we ought to pay less. We ought to, you know, and let the tuition go up and all that sort of thing. And, you know, you and I know that that isn't the way the world works. There is a relationship. There is an absolute, flat-out relationship between funding and performance. And I did make what I feel is kind of a sad reference to the University of Oregon. It's a perfect example of the absolute criticality of that relationship. You can't run a great university underfunded, and that's what happened.
We have a couple of questions back there.
Mr. Gates, one of your slides raised constitutional questions.
Oh,
And could you briefly address that?
yes. Sorry, I skipped over that, and that was a mistake. But in 1933, there's the Culleton case, which was handed down by our state Supreme Court, having to do with the then adopted graduated rate income tax, which had been approved by 70% of the voters. And it goes with the fact that our state constitution provides that a property tax must be equally applied to all properties. So a graduated tax didn't work. As a matter of fact, you couldn't even have exemptions under that language of the state constitution. And the issue was, is income property? And that our state Supreme Court concluded that income was property and hence subject to this limitation in the state constitution. And we've assumed that to be the law for, well, 80 years or so at this point. The fact of the matter is that the case on which they relied in that situation has been overturned, and in every state but one that has considered this question since 1933, they have concluded that income is not property within the meaning of those kinds of limitations, and that in other states that a state income tax is perfectly legal. So there is a good deal of optimism in the legal community that if 1098 is there clearly will be a constitutional challenge. There's no issue about that, because it just will happen, and that we will get a favorable ruling from the state Supreme Court. Now, nothing is for certain, and I could turn out to be wrong, which raises an interesting question of, is it all worth it? But there's no other way, We have to do this to fix this thing, and to take our chances that the wise guys among us, wise guys and girls among us, have a very, very strong conviction that our state Supreme Court at this time would find a different rule.
I have often heard the argument that in addition to our tax structure being the most aggressive, it also makes our revenue tax very, very susceptible to recession. That is, if we have sort of squeezing ways to downturn the economy, it does get what's the evidence for that phenomenon over the years. But I would love to hear your take on it.
Well,
Is our income tax system very, very sensitive to recession?
Okay, I'm not hearing you well, and that's a problem of mine. But is the subject volatility? No, okay.
He wanted to know if recession, if our state tax structure is particularly sensitive to recessions.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, let me answer that this way. I think it's relevant to what you're asking. People who spend a lot of time thinking about these things identify both the sales tax and the income tax as being volatile. And the relative volatility is something that there's some argument about. But what you read about in California is a very prime example of the volatility of the income tax. And what tends to happen is that when things start turning bad, then people stop earning capital gains. And capital gains have a huge amount to do with the income paid by the wealthiest among us. And when capital gains goes away, then the income tax gross receipts are drastically reduced. Now, you're asking the question of whether the nature of our tax system is a contributor to the occurrence of recession. And I guess all I can say is what I've already said, that the sales tax is very volatile. The example that's interesting is that the one ingredient of our revenue stream is a thing called the 1% real estate excise tax, which is a 1% tax on real estate transactions. And it's been around for a while. And it has virtually disappeared. So arguably, there is a relationship between our huge reliance on the sales tax and our having an unfortunate recession. I guess my own judgment is if we had tax makeup like we saw in the other three charts in the other three states, I'm not a bit sure that our situation would be different today than what it is. I really don't know the answer to that.
Mr. Gates, what can we do to help out? How can we get involved?
Well, one of the best things, if you could just write me a check for about $10,000. And talk to him, talk about it. There will be efforts in this neck of the woods to make house calls, make phone calls, the kind of things that win elections. And that, there really isn't much doubt about the fact that these public initiatives are highly dependent on the quality of the political campaign. So anything you can do to be a part of that is something that would be very, very welcome.
I don't see anything in there about dealing with fungibility of education funds, so I'm curious, if 1098 passes and, starts pouring all this money into the coffers for higher education, what's to keep our good friends in Olympia from, once we get dependent on this money, taking the money that's already out there for education now and just moving it somewhere else. And then the 1098 funds fill that void, and then we're back in the same place you are now. I can see that just leading to, we're gonna need more taxes after that.
Can you help me understand?
Yeah, he is asking what's to prevent the legislature from taking the money that is raised through 1098 and shifting it somewhere else.
Okay, well,
No, the money that's already for education now.
Right.
Once this money comes in, they'll just take the money that's in education now and move it somewhere else, because we've got this money now.
Okay,
That's
I-
fungibility of funds.
you know, I guess there's no way of arguing fairly that there's anything other than legislative control of what's going on here, except what I adverted to, which is the referendum, and that's it. It is a fact that a legal fact that 2 years from now, the very protective ingredients of 1098 could be altered by the legislature, and that would, to some extent, be a function of what we say to our legislators about what we want or don't want them to do. I would think, for example, that the passage of this initiative in itself is a very, very strong message to them about what's necessary and what's required in order to run the state the way the citizens of the state would like it to be run. But ultimately, I can't give a lot of assurances about something that would prevent the legislature from doing whatever they decide to do when you get right down to it, except the remedy of a referendum.
I think it's important for people to see that this is not just, may not be a panacea for higher education, because I've seen it in other states that have passed lotteries for education, higher education. They pass the lottery and all this money comes into the coffers, and then the money that's there, they just push it somewhere else. And unless there's a law that says you can't do that, there's nothing to stop the legislators from doing that as soon as this passes. I just think people should be aware of that.
I'm with you.
Maybe you could stand up so I can hear you better.
Mr. Gates, in the last 50 years, 11 states have introduced state income taxes, starting with West Virginia in 1961. And all of those states have shown, in comparison to the rest of the 50 states, decreases in gross state product as well as personal income per capita. I was just wondering if you could briefly respond to the criticism that the introduction of a state income tax would decrease the tax base of the state as a whole.
I just don't see any basis for it. I mean, are you talking about the possibility of wealthy people moving out?
Well, that is one possibility, but also the introduction of an income tax makes the state of Washington, makes it more difficult for the state of Washington to compete on the national scale. There's been data introduced yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that shows that these 11 states that introduced this income tax have had more problems with competing with other states in regards to state product.
Actually, there are 44 states that have an state income tax. I don't know about the 11 that you're talking. Pardon?
For the last 50 years, 11 states have passed income taxes.
Well, okay. But that, Connecticut was the very last one, and Connecticut's alive and well from all I know. I just don't think that people move away because of state taxation unless it's really something haywire with it. But this income tax proposal is nothing out of line with what exists in the case of 43 other states in the union. Now, it is true you can move to maybe Wyoming or Tennessee, Texas. I'm not sure I can name all 6 of the states that would not have income taxes after 1098, but they're few and far between.
This gentleman back here.
Oh,
Please stand up.
Kind of back to Jonah's question over there earlier. 1098, does it specifically say within the guts of 1098 that so much is going to go to education and so much is going to go to retirement, at least for the next couple of years, before there is a possibility that it's changed? Is it a fact within the guts that says yes, it will go straight to education and retirement?
Is there a formula in the initiative that states what percentage of the revenues are going to go to education.
Yes, I'm sorry if I didn't say that. After covering this give back of the B and O and the reduction in the state portion of property tax, then the balance is 70% to education, 30% to healthcare.
Yes,
Maybe the person had asked the question about what we can do. Certainly it's wonderful to have today's here to get some information and to take it on from there. But there is a lot of information on the internet. I'm sure you've all met the students. I know that homework is important in your classes. I think probably you need to take, if you're not really well informed, go to Yes on 1098. There's a plethora of information answering a lot of the questions that you might have. So I would look at it. I would tell my friends. I would tell your parents. Some are very busy. They don't have the time or take the time. Help inform them. You know, I think it's really important.
there was an unpaid political announcement.
Thank you.
I'd like to add, the thing you can do in Pullman is, I'm from the League of Women Voters. We're going to have a voter forum in Colfax and in Pullman dealing with the initiatives. The information is on the fan that I'll be handing out at the door when you leave. Please come. If you want to volunteer to speak for or against the initiative, I need to know your name. The best way we can see that this passes, and the League of Women Voters is one of the people, groups in the state of Washington backing it. We never endorse candidates, but we do take positions on initiatives when we have studied issues and have come to consensus. This is important to us for education, for healthcare, and for all the reasons we've already heard. So please take a fan, come to the forums, ask questions, volunteer to speak for or against initiatives if that's your pleasure. Thanks for coming and thanks for what you've done.
Thank you.
Mr. Gates, will this presentation perhaps be made available on the internet, these videos that are being recorded, so that we might pass this around through the internet and perhaps get more people who aren't here to be aware of it?
The answer is yes.
My associate is saying yes.
You'll be able to find it very shortly on the Foley Institute website. So if you go to the A to Z index on the issue homepage, go to F's Foley Institute, and you'll find it there.
Thank you.
I create an RSO for students for 1098, so it's on the RSO if you want to join the portal. And I'm going to make a Facebook group, and I'm the one that made the event. I'm working with Eastern Washington voters, so feel free to contact me if you want to get involved. And I also wanted to ask Mr. Gates, how do you see this initiative? Do you expect it will help us with our tuitions and budget cuts? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think it will help WSU students and UW students and Eastern Washington students?
Well, you know, we have left it at 70% of whatever, so, and if the forecasts of 2.2 billion thereabouts, 70% of which is 1.6 or 7, so that's a good deal of money. Now, you know, we're talking about a budget and educational expenses in the tens of billions, but it in our judgment, it will, and as time goes along, it will increasingly contribute to the kinds of things we want to do. And it clearly does include both early learning and higher education. Just to focus on a fine point here, the constitutional thing, which is based upon a concept called basic education, is a bit different, because basic education does not, at least not yet, include early learning, and it does not include post-high school. So, but the Educational Trust Fund is available to all levels of the educational program, and people will need to sit and work intelligently and thoughtfully, and by people I mean legislators, to make decisions about how that funding should be allocated. And you know, there are things like increased hours of school and some things of that kind which are not going to come free, and that's the sort of thing which will be financed in part out of this trust fund money. That's the best I can say.
Mr. Gates, I'd like to exercise the moderator's prerogative and ask the final question.
Certainly.
What does the current polling data show with respect to support for opposition to this issue?
I understand that the very most recent poll gave us about a 2% edge, which is a comeback from the beginning where it started quite differently. So, I don't know that one should go out of the room ecstatic about a 2% edge and these polls are really pretty small. But I guess the other good thing is that we've consistently been at about that over the last 4 to 6 weeks. So there's room for some optimism about that.
Thank you, Mr. Gates.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.